something I observed, I think it was in my second video on the Paulo Coelho's The Alchemist, is that today I think you can't get away with writing characters who are uncoded neurodivergent. Like, you can't write AuDHD characters who have autism and ADHD both without coding them as, hey, this person is a weirdo. But that wasn't always the case. And so with Sherlock Holmes and Anne of Green Gables, which I think both of these characters are AuDHD, and both of the authors, I think, were as well, based on what I've read about them, they were coded as they are weird. And I think that is why those stories still resonate with people today. Jack Vance did not do that. And so today, he's kind of a writer's writer. This is just some of the people on the cover who wrote tribute stories to him, and other people who have been heavily influenced aren't in here. Like Gary Gygax's Dungeons & Dragons, the magic system was based on Vance's Dying Earth. So he was hugely influential among writers, publishers, editors, and they kept pushing his books to an audience, and the science fiction fantasy audience of the time was more weird, more willing to accept weird characters without explanation of pointing out this is a weird character. But today, there is the weirdness of the character is seen as the point, and you're expected to sort of meet a sort of everyman standard. Like, if you look at Harry Potter, for example, very normal character. And I think that's sort of the expectation people have in fiction, is even neurodivergent writers writing neurodivergent characters should be coding them. And I think that is part of why Sherlock Holmes and Anne of Green Gables still endure today, is that the authors, who themselves, I think, were AuDHD, wrote these characters realistically, but they also coded them as, hey, these are weird characters. And one thing that really convinced me with Conan Doyle is, so the last two of the stories in the last Sherlock Holmes short story collection didn't enter public domain until 2023. And so a lot of American collections didn't have that. This one, which I have, which is from the Sherlock Holmes Museum in Britain, does. And it's interesting because in the one of the last stories, which was public domain, but they wouldn't release, people wouldn't reprint the book until the last two fell into public domain. One of those stories was The Case of the Blanche Soldier. And in this story, which is one of two written from the perspective of Holmes, Holmes explains his method. And I've described the way I think as being upside down and outside in from how most people think. And the way he's describing it, I'm like, I totally get it, but I've also seen other people who kind of think this way. Like, they will try to explain, this is how I'm thinking, and then people are like, no, I don't get it, it's magic, because it's thinking kind of reverse from how most people think. And so Richard Feynman, Nate Silver, Nassim Nicholas Taleb, three examples, I've seen them explain their thinking, and then people, it's obvious to me, I'm like, yeah, I get what you're saying, and then other people are like, no, still doesn't make sense how you did that. And that is what Conan Doyle wrote with Holmes, is he's explaining his process, and I'm like, yeah, that is how I process. But then Watson doesn't get it, and that's sort of the point of these stories, which is interesting to me. And then Anne of Green Gables, I've read that people think she wrote this, Lucy Maude Montgomery, basically because she was Anne, and she wanted a story where she had a happier childhood than what she actually had. And one of the interesting things about Anne, so she struggles socially, and she also struggles with attention issues. So again, very AuDHD coded. And one of the things she talks about that really resonated with me here, I first read this as an adult, but it was still interesting, especially for this, is she says, I make a lot of mistakes, but I only make each mistake once. And so eventually I'll run out of mistakes to make, which is sort of like how I do things, and also sort of like what Nassim Nicholas Taleb in the book Antifragile calls the via negativa, which is corresponds with Sherlock Holmes, where famously said, eliminate the impossible, and whatever remains, however improbable, must be the solution. And Taleb's via negativa, again, it is, okay, take things out until you come to the answer. And so there is this pattern, ADHD plus autism, not everyone has it, but some people do, and it's, again, I call it upside down, outside in thinking, that you see in Sherlock Holmes explaining his own method, kind of in Anne of Green Gables explaining how she thinks, and then also you see it in Taleb and Feynman and Silver explaining how they think. And when you look at how Vance's characters think, it's the same kind of thinking. But Vance generally doesn't note his characters as being weird. And one of his only character who I would say comes across as AuDHD coded, who is actually memorable and discussed is Magnus Ridolf, who is basically just his science fiction ripoff of Sherlock Holmes. And aside from that, all of Vance's other most memorable characters are the ones who do not come across as AuDHD to me. And so that was just quick. I wanted to talk about that because I've been thinking about that for a while. Thanks for watching. I'm Magpie, and I'll see y'all in the next one.